Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. A US State Department report says China may have secretly set off low-level underground nuclear test explosions despite claiming to observe an international pact banning such blasts. That pact is a reference to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty of '96. Both the US and China are signatories to the CTBT, but neither has ratified the treaty. Three other countries from the 44 annexed Tier 2 states that have signed but not ratified the treaty are Egypt, Israel, and Iran. The State Department finding was first reported by the Wall Street Journal, a US newspaper. Commentators say the report could worsen already strained Sino-US ties. US has also continued to blame Beijing for what Washington calls Beijing's mishandling of the 2019 outbreak of COVID-19 in the city of Wuhan. The CTBT is a zero-yield treaty. In other words, it prohibits all nuclear explosions that produce a self-sustaining supercritical chain reaction. China has reacted to the finding by categorically rejecting it. China says it is committed to a moratorium on nuclear tests. China has always adopted a responsible attitude, earnestly fulfilling the international obligations and promises it has assumed. The US criticism of China is entirely groundless, without foundation, and not worth refuting. This was a statement issued by the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson. The US has not tested a nuclear weapon since 1992 and has what it calls a stockpile stewardship program. The SSP refers to US capability to reliably test and maintain its nuclear weapons without the use of nuclear testing. To discuss this issue further, we have with us David Sedney, a senior associate at Center for Strategic and International Studies and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense. We also have with us Einar Tangen, who is an analyst and joins me from Beijing. Let me just dive straight into this. Gentlemen, starting with David Sedney. What is this report about? I mean, there's also an international monitoring system. Is the report relying on that? It also says China may have. So there's a certain degree of lack of certainty there. Give me your read of it, David.
Well, this is actually a fairly complex area of nuclear engineering. The ban on test, which as you defined it earlier, is accurate, but there are so-called hydronuclear tests, which are tests that go to the low at critical mass. However, the question as to whether any particular hydronuclear test, which is a very small sort of pinprick kind of test, actually goes beyond the critical mass or not, is something that is not always clear even to those who are doing those tests. And for the US to make such a statement, and I think you accurately fastened on the may, it's clear that there are great doubts and there's a great deal of lack of transparency about this issue. And I think you did right in putting it into context of the overall US-China relationship. There have been suspicions in the US nuclear community for some time that China's tests have gone beyond the critical threshold, but no 100% clear knowledge, at least as far as I know from outside the government. The issuing of this report at this time, I think probably it does have a lot to do with the overall relationship. And the truth of the matter can only be found if you're into the labs, and neither the United States, nor China, nor Russia, the three countries that do carry out these kind of experiments, is going to let anybody else into their labs. So we're never going to get full clarity on this issue.
So, okay, I have a couple of other questions also with reference to what you have said, David, but let me hop over to Einar Tangen here. Mr. Tangen, what's your read of the US State Department report? I mean, I just said, as far as the Chinese Foreign Ministry is concerned, the spokesperson has categorically rejected the report.
Well, I would defer to David. I mean, this is really a political issue, especially coming at this time. What you have is the Trump administration is basically coming out every day with a new accusation against China in a kind of furtherance of his political campaign, which is to paint China as somehow the aggressor here, is somehow responsible for the lack of his action in terms of COVID-19. And this is just part of that. As was stated by my colleague, David, there's no way that you can verify this. I mean, China could say, well, we've seen a lot of activity at U.S. nuclear facilities, therefore we assume that they're doing something that is untoward. And that's basically what this comes down to.
There's another issue related to this, which is not vis-a-vis China, but which is about the internal U.S. debate in the community, both the strategic policymakers and also the scientists, with reference to CTBT. Now, what happened in '98. I mean, President Clinton was investing a lot into that, but the Senate, for political reasons at that time, refused to ratify the CTBT. Now, with this kind of report out, do you think it could also have some kind of impact on the internal discussion in the United States with reference to whether the U.S. did the right thing by signing the CTBT, whether U.S. should ratify the treaty or not ratify the treaty? It seems to also open up that kind of discussion.
I'm not sure that it will open up discussion on the CTBT per se, but the increasing ability of major nuclear powers, and in that I would include both China and Russia, to carry out these kind of hydronuclear experiments that I mentioned before, coupled with very sophisticated computer modeling, does have the potential to increase countries' capabilities in terms of the kinds and strength of nuclear munitions. However, I would say the real issue is more not the CTBT, but the issue of the overall size of the arsenals and the issue of fissile material. Those are the two areas where I think there is the most discussion right now. I would again place this particular report, and again, you focused exactly on the right word, May. I would focus this on the issue of the overall U.S.-China relationship rather than on the larger issue of nuclear weapons, where, and in that area, the question of whether we move forward with the Russians on renewal of the New START treaty, that's actually a much bigger issue.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point. So just to carry it forward, David, the overall tenor of Sino-US relations at this point, do you think that this is now a sort of cardinal principle of US strategic outreach to look at China as a contender and sort of counter that through various means, including by making such allegations? Does that not increase the risk of some kind of miscalculation in areas like the South China Sea, elsewhere?
Certainly, the risk of miscalculation is increasing. And what has happened over the last few months on COVID, and then before that in the high degree of trade tensions, have only made that more dangerous. I would add to the South China Sea, Taiwan, with the election of a new government in Taiwan, which was very much opposed by the government in Beijing. And all of those areas are areas that are ripe for misunderstanding and miscalculation by both sides. The ability of the two countries to communicate, however, seems to remain fairly strong. Just a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago or so, President Trump and President Xi Jinping had what both apparently described as a reasonably positive phone call. So while the possibility of miscalculation is there, I do think that there are a lot of institutional breaks on that, including the high-level communication between the U.S. and Chinese leaders. But underneath all that, the struggle between the U.S. and China for dominance, at least in East Asia, if not the rest of the world, is something that's going to be with us for decades to come.
That's something which I would agree with, David. Mr. Tangen, do you think that the institutional structure, both in China and in the US, will be helpful in diffusing any tensions. But equally, the fact that the Sino-US, shall I say, rivalry or sort of, the attempt for the US to retain the space that it has and for China to claim that space is something that we need to look out for and which will define, as David said, next couple of decades, if not more.
Well, yes, obviously there are tensions between the US and China, but I think they're manufactured more than real. China's rise is basically economic. They have not started any wars. They have not tried to invade any countries, this type of thing. But they do feel very much threatened by the US and its insistence that it controls or has rich not only in money, but also in resources. China is not. It's in terms of resources per person, it's down near 100 in the list of countries around in the world. So China needs to be able to import resources, add value to them, and export them. That means that it is much more vulnerable to any kind of blockade or any kind of action by the US. And I think that's what you're getting here. The US is insisting that China is being an aggressive power when in fact it's the US pressure on these areas that makes China continually afraid. So, in essence, what you have here is the road that you chose to avoid, unfortunately, is going to lead you to the same destination, which is this kind of idea that China is trying to establish its own hegemony in place of the US's hegemony. And I don't think that is the case. I mean, everything that you can look at in terms of China does not point to any kind of armed security risk per se. It really has to do with the economics and this kind of passive aggressive fear that the US has that China is somehow seeking to create a new empire.
Well, but a final question before I let you go. I mean, if you look at this from a structural realist viewpoint, then China's rise essentially means there's going to be power projection. Now, that power projection can be on the basis of economic and soft power, but at the back of that, there's also going to be the military power. And we know that China is doing a lot of R&D and spending a lot of money, not as much as the US does. That's a completely different league altogether, but in terms of modernizing military capabilities and the rest of it. And so that, in a way, that process is a bit deterministic and is going to move in the way that it is moving. And then a point would come where there will be a much higher risk of some kind of incident or some kind of tension which will probably not get diffused.
Well, you're talking about the classic Thucydides trap, and
Yes.
You can look at it, and as long as you see it as a zero-sum game. But if you start looking at the economic realities which underlie this, what you'll see is that the U.S.'s importance globally in terms of share of GDP has been going down, but not in direct relation to China's rise. What you have is, in essence, the rise of Asia. In terms of how much money is going there. If you look at the wealth line, where is the wealth in the world? You'll see that it's been moving toward Asia. And it's not just, as I said, China. So, I mean, it's easy to focus on China as the quote culprit in the US's lessening importance in the world, especially economically.
No, let me clarify. I am not putting any value judgment on what the US does or what China is doing. I'm simply looking at it from a structural perspective. And I believe that in that, there's a lot of evidence that China wants to project power. It's in the nature of a rising power to do that. It's in the nature of an established power to try and counter that.
I believe that's the kind of what I would call zero-sum game. The fact is that China is, as I said, dependent on natural resources coming from other sources. So it's looking to protect its ability to get these sources of raw materials. As I said, China does not have them. The U.S. does.
Okay, that was Mr. Einar Tangen speaking with us. Let me go back to David Sedney. David, would you agree with my assertion that there is a structural sort of inevitability here in terms of the existing power and the rising power, and that and you know since Mr. Tangen mentioned the Thucydides trap, when Graham Allison actually has done that project at Harvard, talking about this, and over the last 500 years, out of 16 such conditions, 12 resulted in war. So give me your sense of, and since you've been a practitioner also, and you know how the thinking works inside the Beltway, what is your take on where this is going?
Well, first of all, I don't think that history is deterministic. I think there are choices along the way. The question of, I think it's too simplistic to just look at this as China as a rising power and the U.S. as a status quo power, because conflict is possible in such situations, but not inevitable. Much more important in determining whether there's conflict is whether there is agreement on the basic rules of the game, on the basic world structure. So if you look back 100 or so years ago, the United Kingdom was the world's dominant power, and the U.S. was the rising power. But there was not a conflict. The U.S. and the United Kingdom did not go to war, and through a whole series of historical facts that we could go into, the U.S. replaced the United Kingdom as the world's leading power without a war. So war is not inevitable in this rising state kind of thinking. And I believe what's important is ideology. And this is where I have to disagree with Einar. Beijing is not acting like a country that is only interested in economic growth and economic power. Its recent opening of military bases in Djibouti, for example, for decades, the Chinese government, the Chinese military said they had no interest in foreign bases, and only hegemonistic powers such as the U.S. had foreign bases. Now China has bases in Djibouti.
That's precisely the structural issue that I was talking about, David. We could have further discussion on this, but I am running out of time. So thank you so much for speaking with us. I'm also now joined by Andrew KP Loom, who is a strategist on China at Andrew Leung International Consultants. Mr. Leung, thank you for joining us. We were talking about the State Department report that was reported by the Wall Street Journal with reference to the possibility that China may have tested a low-yield device. But then during the discussion, the bigger picture emerged with reference to US-China relations and the sort of, the tenor of those relations. So David also, and earlier Einar Tangen also said that we need to sort of look at this report with reference to the overall Sino-US relations. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I'd like to pick up on the early discussion about this kind of rivalry between two superpowers. One existing superpower feeling its dominance is under challenge, the so-called Thucydides trap, and under which, according to history, is 12 out of 16 cases resulted in war. But I think that if you look at China, China is very, very different from the 16 cases covered in the so-called Thucydides trap research, because all these 16 countries were European powers, and they were military powers. And then they expanded their territory and put the boots on the ground. Now China has never invaded any country. And talking about Djibouti, it is only one out of many, and it's only in recent years, because Djibouti is very strategic kind of position for China's energy supplies. And indeed, Djibouti is not the military base for China alone. And then before China, the United States was there, and even Japan was there, France was there. So I think that that cannot be used as an example that China is now trying to expand its military bases. But if you look about the rivalry is no doubt there. That's all for all to see, because for many years, the United States thought that China could be a useful player to sustain the US-led Western liberal order. But now China's the economy is growing over the past couple of decades, even bigger than the US economy in the not too distant future, and also technology, and then in the South China Sea, trade, a lot of the trade practices. So all in all, the impression has been created in the United States across the aisle. It's not just the Trump administration; it's also the Democrats across the aisle that China is an existential threat. And the existential threat is even more frightening because it's coming from a different ideology, a different kind of civilization, if you like. Now, China is a civilization state with thousands of years of history. And then, as I said, China has never invaded countries, never put boots on the ground. And what China wants is not really to displace the United States leadership, because China is not
Leung, one of the arguments that people present with reference to, every time the argument comes up that China has not invaded another country, that for the last more than 100 years, China just did not have the sinews and the muscles to do that. But if we go back into history, we see lots of warfare and the rest of it. So now China is also investing a lot in military modernization. China has also been showing the reach of its flag in South China Sea. So creating a Monroe Doctrine of sorts of its own. And those are issues that obviously have caught the attention of commentators across the world, not just in the US, but elsewhere also.
It's true, because I think that at the heart of it all is an inability to understand what China really is and what China really wants. And because there is no way that China could really colonize a lot of countries. And in fact, China has never put boots on the ground. And in fact, China is not capable of doing that. Even though its military has been increasing, there is no match aircraft carrier by aircraft carrier. China's only got one aircraft carrier, very old a model comes to that. But even in terms of nuclear warheads, it's less than a tenth of the nuclear warheads possessed by the United States, and then let alone the global reach of U.S. Military might. Now, I think that China would be very, very to really compete with the United States on the military. But of course, China's economy has a global reach, and then there are more countries depending on China's economy than on the U.S. economy. There are more countries for which China is the largest trading partner compared with the United States. So all in all, China's influence is growing. But the growth of China's influence is not conquest. It is influence. Of course, China wants to become a big country, a powerful country, wants to be treated on a par with the United States. And then because of pride, prejudice, fear, I think that translates into a 360 degrees pushback against China. That is understandable. Let alone China's, a lot of the things China has been doing leave a lot to be desired in terms of transparency, in terms of its trade practices. But then I think that at the heart of it all is that whether there should be a one-size-fits-all model for the entire world, and China is now trying to challenge that kind of contention.
Precisely. Thank you so much. That was KP Loom speaking with us. We'll take a short break and return to discuss the religious isolation of Muslims in India. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. The US Commission on International Religious Freedom has expressed concern over religious segregation in India during the COVID-19 pandemic. Earlier, Indian media reported that in Gujarat, Muslims and Hindus patients were being kept in separate wards under the government's orders. In a tweet, the US body said such actions will further increase stigmatization of Muslims in India and fan more hatred against them. Meanwhile, thousands of migrant workers are still stranded in different states, including Kerala and Bihar. To discuss this further, we are joined by Nishant Verma, an analyst based in Delhi, and Michael Kugelman, Deputy Director, Asia Program at Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. So let's cut to the chase. Michael, we are here witnessing not a cause, but an effect. A government that is right-wing and whose stormtroopers in the streets belong to the Sangh Parivar. So the segregation that we were talking about has a much broader scale than just keeping Hindu and Muslim patients separate in hospitals. Would you agree?
Well, yes. I mean, we all know what has taken place in India over the last few years, given that you've had politics that's become increasingly toxic and communal. But what's unfortunate is that at a time of a national emergency, really at a time of a global emergency, you would expect politics set aside in order to pursue a unified response to such a major challenge like coronavirus. But, you know, what we see, not just in India, but in much of the world, is not an easing, but more of an exacerbation of this hyper-partisan, hyper-polarized politics that's been on display for a long time. And, you know, what appears to be the case in India is that these communal politics continue to be on full display. So, you know, you mentioned the incident that that U.S. body had reported. I think what's also troubling is all of this fear-mongering and news media reporting and even fake news that has essentially tried to target and blame the Muslim community for the spread of coronavirus in India. And you know what's quite notable is that the government has really been very quiet about all that. And I think that this dynamic really finds the Indian government's efforts to show that it's waging a careful, responsible, well thought out response to this global pandemic as it's playing out in India.
Well, Michael, here's another thing. Since you keep a close watch on South Asia, India has seen rioting over many decades. There have been communal clashes and the rest of it for reasons that did not have much to do with religion per se, but religion was used as a marker. What we are witnessing, and I don't know if you'll agree with me, is the fact that this particular government seems to, look at not just this as a problem, but is also either passively quiet and therefore fans the flames, or actively, essentially pulls in people who are known to be troublemakers. Now, this is something which people have begun to point out both in India and outside of India. Is this something that you think is likely to go further and create more problem for the minorities in India?
One thing to be concerned about is that one would expect that when this pandemic has ended, and India will be in a position, like many countries, where it suffered major economic distress and will need to focus on economic recovery. Now, India had already had a significant economic slowdown before the pandemic, and what I fear could happen is that the government, in order to distract its main, or the ruling party, in order to distract its main support base from the economic distress, the government's troubles to get it back in order again, and intensify these divisive politics, these nationalistic, Hindu nationalistic politics. So, indeed, I fear that what we've seen play out over the last few years could well intensify. And of course, the ruling BJP, it's had for many years a particular agenda that it seems to have implemented more aggressively over the last few years. But I don't think that the BJP would want to abandon this long-standing Hindu nationalist agenda. And again, the economic distress wrought by the pandemic will, I think, give it more of a pretext to double down on that type of politics.
Well, that prognosis is, but I agree with you that this could get worse. But let me pull in Nishant Verma here. Mr. Verma, what is your reading of this?
Okay, hi. Thanks for having me on the program. One thing is for sure, that any government in any part of the world, when is unable to perform good governance, deviate and adopt measures and unwarranted steps which are not desired in a social environment. BJP is no less, unfortunately. We are aware of the anti-certain segment of society behavior of the RSS since inception. But then, coming to the larger question in the pandemic time, first of all, let me clarify. I was the one who got in touch with the government of Gujarat through a common person, and the order which is being stated was given by the government of keeping Hindus and Muslims in separate wards in the hospital was not given by the government, has been clarified. The issue was that the superintendent of the hospital took his decision on his own, and that's regrettable. Secondly, with regards to what is happening in the country, that even when COVID-19 is, very much relevant here in India, and politics on the sectorial divide of India and Muslims has begun, was anticipated. Reason being, per my understanding, the failure of initiating steps right in the beginning to nip in the bud about this disease in India was not taken by the government at that point in time, which I mean is January and February 2020. Now they have to take some side in order to save their face. Okay. So primarily what I understand is that the Bharatiya Janata Party-led government in India will have to stop this Hindu-Muslim nonsense that is going on the political front, only because that's not the way to deal with the situation. But yes, the local politics that happens here is to save the face, and Mr. Modi has to step in as and when he has to.
So one of the things that we have witnessed, now there was the BJP government under the late Mr. Vajpayee also. Mr. Vajpayee was also in his youth an apparatchik for the RSS, as was Mr. Modi. But Mr. Modi has, he basically has given a lot of space to, as I said in my opening, the stormtroopers of Sangh Parivar. Now, that is something that it's very difficult to reverse such processes once they get into motion. And on top of that, as you mentioned, if there is a lot of misgovernance also, then we are looking at a situation where things could get really bad for the minorities. And that is something which would be extremely unfortunate.
I again disagree, because it was Mr. Vajpayee's government under which we saw the 2002 of Gujarat. So it is not that only the chief minister of a state is responsible. When it comes to those phrases that Mr. Vajpayee used about the government, it was his responsibility as the prime minister also. However, what has happened now is that RSS is now being fueled a little more by Mr. Modi, only for one reason, that on the government side, Mr. Modi has lost the plot. Although in 2019, they came back with a thumping majority, but then such kind of a ruling behavior is always short-lived. Mr. Vajpayee and Mr. Modi have a difference. Mr. Vajpayee also did communal politics through RSS and BJP. However, he worked for the country on certain fronts. Mr. Modi, unfortunately, both to have worked for the people in the country, which he has not in terms of yielding a result, The only thing common remains is that doing politics, and the best is to catch Muslims.
Okay. That was Mr. Nishant Verma speaking with us. Thank you so much for your insights. Before I wrap up this segment, let me go back to Michael Kugelman. Michael, there's this talk about misgovernance. One of the things that people talked about or trotted out when Mr. Modi was the Chief Minister of Gujarat was that, he really lifted that state up in terms of development and the rest of it. But it seems that, and this is his second term as a Prime Minister, that he hasn't really been able to deliver to the rest of the India what people thought he did as far as the state of Gujarat was concerned.
Well, this is a good point. And I think that he realized that it's very difficult to take what you do in one state, and particularly one that was already known for having a dynamic entrepreneurial environment, and trying to replicate that across the entire country. I think it was really as simple as that. And of course, he ran into a situation where he was dealing with a number of states that were have been controlled by other parties. And it just became a lot more difficult. And indeed, I think that this government's failure to address economic reform and more recently economic recovery is something that will really stay with the party. And as I said earlier, could be a spark for an intensification of the communal politics, this toxic brew of communalism and Hindu nationalism that could really lead to a fair amount of instability down the road in India. And as I said before, the fact that this government, and Modi specifically, has been so incredibly quiet about what's playing out on the ground, that I think is what is very troubling. Modi himself is not the one saying the really nasty things all the time, but it's the fact that he's so silent in the face of what others in the party are saying and what's playing out on the ground. For me, that's what's particularly troubling.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Michael Kugelman with us. This is all for this week from Indus Special. We shall see you next Thursday at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.